For decades, the standard answer seemed clean. A Viking warrior died. His family placed a few silver coins in his grave. The coins paid for his passage to the afterlife. Valhalla or hell, the toll was the same. Scholars called it the obol tradition, borrowing from the Greek myth of Charon and the ferryman. In Scandinavia, the custom looked ancient. It made sense. Then, the evidence stopped cooperating. In 2018, the archaeologist Sven Kalmering led a study of 80 graves at Varnhem in Sweden. Varnhem is a quiet site in Västergötland, famous for its medieval Cistercian abbey, but also for a rich pagan cemetery. The graves dated from the 9th to the 11th century. Kalmering and his team combined osteological analysis with a careful re-examination of every coin. They checked the age and sex of each skeleton. They mapped exactly where the coins lay. They counted how many there were. The results undercut the old story. Coin placement varied wildly. Some coins were near the head. Some were by the feet. Many were at the pelvis or tucked under the arm. If a family intended a universal payment, where was the consistent ritual? And the number of coins ranged from 1 to dozens. The deceased with the most coins were not necessarily rich or powerful. They were often young men buried with weapons. Something else was driving the pattern. The study forced a new question. If the coins were not fees for the underworld, what were they doing there? Kalmering's answer pointed not to belief, but to economy. The coins were not currency for the dead. They were biography for the living. The most telling burial was grave 59. It held a male aged between 25 and 30 years. Osteologists found healed fractures on his ribs and a deep cut on his left femur that had never fully mended. He had not died old and comfortable. He had died scarred. Beside him lay a sword and a wooden shield with an iron boss. These were standard warrior kit, but the coins were not standard. 12 silver dirhams rested in a cluster near his pelvis. They had been placed there carefully, probably inside a small pouch that rotted away centuries ago. Each dirham was a thin silver disc stamped with angular script. That script was Kufic Arabic. Every coin carried the name of Nasr Second ibn Ahmad, the Samanid ruler who reigned from 914 to 943 AD. The mint was Samarkand, one of the great cities of Central Asia. The coins were struck in 934 AD, give or take a year. The man in grave 59 died sometime after that date. He had never seen Samarkand. He had almost certainly never traded directly with any Samanid merchant. But someone had carried those dirhams from the eastern edge of the Islamic world to a Swedish grave field. That journey took years and crossed thousands of miles. Classical obol tradition required a single coin in the mouth or on the eyelids. Grave 59 held 12 coins at the pelvis. There was nothing classical about it. The dirhams were not paying a ferryman, they were declaring something louder. They said, this man was part of the silver network. To understand how Samanid dirhams reached Varnhem, you have to follow the river. Not a river in Sweden, a river in Russia, the Volga. In 922 AD, the Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan journeyed north from Baghdad as an envoy to the Volga Bulgars. He kept a detailed account of everything he saw. 50 years later, his manuscript described a people he called the Rus. These were Norse traders and slavers who had established a camp on the Volga near the Bulgar capital of Itil. They arrived every summer with ships loaded with furs and slaves. The furs came from the northern forests. The slaves came from raids on Slavic villages. Ibn Fadlan watched the Rus trade. They did not barter for goods. They demanded silver dirhams. The Bulgar merchants paid in coins minted in Samarkand and Bukhara and Nishapur. The dirhams flowed out of the Samanid Empire along the network of Muslim merchants who crossed the Caspian Sea and moved up the Volga. The Rus accepted the coins but did not use them as money. In Scandinavia, there was no mint economy. Silver was silver. You tested a dirham by pecking it with a knife to see if the base metal showed beneath the surface. You cut it into smaller pieces to reach the right weight for a transaction. This was hack silver. The dirhams became raw material. The journey from the Pangaea silver mines in the Hindu Kush to a Viking grave in Varnhem took about 2 years. The silver moved from miners to Samanid mints, to Volga trading posts, to Rus ships, to Baltic markets. And then a warrior died. And someone dropped 12 of those silver discs into his grave. Pick up a silver dirham from a Viking hoard and turn it over in your hand. You will see small nicks and cuts along the edges. They look like knife wounds on metal. That is exactly what they are. The Vikings pecked each coin with a blade to test its purity. A deep cut revealed the interior. If the silver was debased with copper, the nick would show a reddish tint. If the coin was solid silver, the cut stayed bright and pale. This was the routine of every transaction. No coin was trusted without a peck. The Cuerdale hoard, found in Lancashire in 1840, tells the story plainly. Buried around 905 AD, it contained over 8,000 pieces of silver. Most of them were not whole coins. They were fragments, cut arms from silver rings, hacked ingots, and chopped dirhams. The hoard was a bag of scrap, but it was not trash. Every piece was measured by weight. The Vikings used small folding scales and balance weights carried in leather pouches. A trader would place a dirham on one pan and a set of weights on the other. If the coin was too heavy, he cut off a piece until the scales balanced. That is why so many dirhams from Scandinavian hoards are missing corners. In 2016, Dr. Jane Kershaw of the University of Oxford published an isotopic analysis of dirhams found in Viking graves across Sweden and Denmark. Her team measured the lead isotope ratios in the silver. The results linked the metal directly to the Pangaea mines in the Hindu Kush, east of modern Herat. The same mines had been operating under the Samanid Empire for decades. The silver journeyed from the mountains of Central Asia to a Viking cutting table somewhere in the Baltic. There, a blade bit into the edge. The peck mark survives to this day. It is the trace of a decision made in a marketplace 1,000 years ago. The dirhams did not end up in graves by accident. Their placement was deliberate and public. A Viking funeral was not a small family affair. It was a community spectacle. The body was laid out on a pyre or in a ship while mourners gathered to watch the goods go in. Ibn Fadlan saw this with his own eyes in 922 AD along the Volga. He described the burial of a Rus chieftain. The man's ship was pulled onto land. A funeral bed was made on deck. Then the relatives arrived. Each one brought gifts, weapons, food, drink, and silver coins. The goods were placed on display before the dead man. Ibn Fadlan wrote that they laid the offerings out so everyone could see them. It was a show of wealth and connection. The coins in a grave advertised who the dead had known and where he had been. A warrior buried at Varnhem with 12 Samanid dirhams was not paying a ghostly ferryman. He was showing his community that he had access to the Volga trade. The dirhams were proof of a journey. They were a biography written in silver. Every coin was a node in the network that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Baltic. The living arranged them around the body so the dead man would be remembered as a traveler and a trader. This was not a quiet ritual of the afterlife. It was a loud public statement about status in this life. The more exotic the coin, the farther the reach of the deceased. A dirham from Samarkand said more than a local arm ring ever could. The grave became a map of human connection. The coins were the pins. Not all Vikings saw the dirham as simple bullion for display. Some had started to listen to Christian ideas. By the late 9th century, Norse traders had come into regular contact with Christian communities in the British Isles and along the Frankish coast. They saw something new. Christians put a single coin in the mouth of the dead. They called it the obol. It followed an older Greek and Roman tradition of paying the ferryman Charon to cross the river Styx. Christian graves in early medieval England often contained a single silver penny placed on the lips or under the tongue. The custom was quiet and personal. It was not a public statement, it was a ticket. Ottar was a Norse chieftain from Hålogaland in northern Norway. Around 890 AD, he travelled to the court of King Alfred of Wessex and told his story. An Anglo-Saxon scribe wrote it down. Ottar described the burial customs of his people. He said that the dead were placed inside a mound with their weapons and their coins. He did not explain why the coins went in, but a later observer named Rimbert, who wrote about the mission of Saint Ansgar to Birka in the 830s, noted that the local Norse sometimes left coins at burial mounds as offerings. The line between pagan custom and Christian borrowing was starting to blur. By the 10th century, some Viking graves show a clear syncretic practice. A dirham was placed in the mouth of the deceased, exactly as Christians placed the obol. But the coin was not a Christian penny. It was a salmonid dirham with peck marks and cut edges. The dead Viking was using the local material to perform a borrowed gesture. The shape of the ritual was Christian. The coin was still silver from Pangaea. The two worlds touched inside a single grave. The old poets of Iceland left behind a book of wisdom called the Havamal. It is a collection of sayings attributed to Odin himself. In stanza 77, the poem offers a famous line. "Cattle die, kinsmen die," the poet said. "You yourself shall die the same way. But one thing I know that never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds." The poem says nothing about coins. It says nothing about payment for the road to the underworld, the fame of a dead man's deeds. That is what survives, not a purse full of silver for a ferryman. In the Norse cosmos, hell was not a toll bridge. The dead did not queue at a riverbank, waiting to pay a coin to a hooded figure. They simply walked the road to hell. The road was long and cold and dark, but it had no toll. The goddess Hel demanded no fee. She took the dead because they were dead. That was the only price. The careful reader of the Eddas finds no command to bury the dead with silver for the next world. The Havamal advises generosity to the living. A man should give gifts while he is alive. The giving builds reputation, and reputation is what never dies. Now compare this with the Roman world. Roman graves often contain a single coin placed in the mouth of the deceased. The coin was the obol for Charon. Charon ferried the dead across the river Styx. He would not take a passenger without payment. The ritual was explicit. The coin was a ticket. The belief was clear. Viking graves with coins in the mouth look like an echo of this Roman custom. But the Norse had no Charon. They had no Styx. The dirham in the mouth of a 10th century Viking at Varnhem was not payment for a ferryman who did not exist. It was something else. It was a borrowed gesture. A Christian shape filled with Viking silver. The fame of a dead man's deeds mattered more than any coin. But the coin helped tell the story. 3 graves from 3 different Viking towns, Each one treats coins differently. Each one tells a different story about intent and access. Birka grave B581 sits on the island of Björkö in Lake Mälaren, Sweden. This grave became famous in 2017 when DNA analysis confirmed the skeleton was female. The woman in B581 was buried with a full set of weapons, a sword, an axe, a spear, a quiver full of arrows. 2 horses lay at her feet, but there were no coins, not a single dirham. Instead, she was given game pieces, Nefertafel pieces made of antler. The grave announced her identity not through silver, but through strategy and violence. She was a warrior. Her status came from command, not commerce. Hedeby grave 2010-1 tells a different story. Hedeby was the great trading town at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, in what is now northern Germany. Excavators opened a chamber grave in 2010 and found a bronze bowl. Inside that bowl lay 49 cut dirhams. The coins had been deliberately fragmented, pieces of Samanid silver stacked in a vessel. This was not a purse for spending. This was a statement. The dead person had access to the silver trade. They owned the raw material. The grave said, "I was a node in the network." Gnezdovo grave 13 sits near Smolensk in western Russia. The grave held a single dirham split in half. One half lay with the body, the other half was gone. The split coin was a deliberate act, 2 halves of 1 dirham separated in death. Perhaps the other half was kept by the living. A bond between the dead and the survivor. A token of connection that survived the grave. 3 graves, no coins. 49 cut coins. 1 split coin. Each choice was a decision. Each grave said something different about the person inside. The coins were not automatic. They were selected. They were arranged. They were a message written in silver. The dirhams buried in Viking graves did not begin in Scandinavia. They began high in the mountains of Central Asia. The Panjshir mines sat in the Hindu Kush range, in what is now Afghanistan. In the 9th century, these mines produced silver at an astonishing rate. Up to 200,000 dirhams per year came from Panjshir alone. The silver was dug from the earth by enslaved labourers. Men worked in darkness with hand tools. They pulled ore from narrow tunnels that twisted through the mountain. The work was dangerous. Cave-ins were common. The air was thin and hot. The labourers were largely non-Muslim captives taken in slave raids across Central Asia. They mined the silver that would become dirhams. The raw ore was carried down the mountain to the mint city of Samarkand. There it was smelted and stamped into coins. The Samanid dynasty controlled this trade. Their mints struck dirhams by the millions. Each coin carried the name of the emir and the year of striking. The silver was pure and heavy. It was the standard currency of the Islamic world. From Samarkand, the dirhams moved north along the caravan routes. They crossed the Oxus River. They passed through the cities of Khwarazm. They reached the Volga River and the great trading camps of the Bulgars. There, the Norse met them. The Northmen brought furs and slaves and honey. They exchanged these goods for silver. The dirhams travelled 5,000 kilometers from the Hindu Kush to the Baltic Sea. The human cost of this journey was immense. Enslaved miners in the mountains, enslaved captives sold on the Volga. The silver that ended up in a Viking grave in Sweden began with the labour of people who never saw Scandinavia. The coins carried the weight of that journey. When a Viking warrior was buried with a handful of dirhams, the silver brought the whole world with it. The mine, the mint, the caravan, the trade. The dead warrior was buried with a piece of the global network. The silver connected him to places he had never seen. The coins in the grave were not a bribe for the ferryman. They were not a down payment on Valhalla. The evidence points in a different direction entirely. The dirhams functioned as three things at once: a display object, a bullion reserve, and an occasional syncretic charm, but never a universal afterlife currency. The old assumption crumbles under the weight of the archaeological record. No Eddic verse commands the living to bury silver with the dead. No saga describes a toll at the gates of hell. The Norse understood the value of silver in this world, not the next. Return to Varnhem grave 59. A warrior from the 10th century was laid in the ground with 12 silver dirhams. Those coins were struck in Samarkand in the year 934 AD. They bore the name of the Samanid Emir Nasser II. They travelled 5,000 kilometers through the hands of traders, slaves, and warriors. They were pecked for purity and cut for weight. They were not chosen at random. Each dirham was a piece of biography. The warriors' community knew what those coins meant. They knew the roots, they knew the labor, they knew the status that came with access to such silver. The grave goods advertised a life lived at the edge of a global network. The burial was a public statement. The dirhams said that this man had touched a world far beyond the local fjord. The silver connected him to the mines of Panjir, the markets of Khwarazm, the camps of the Volga Bulgars. His grave was a biography written in metal. The real reason for the coins was not about paying for passage. It was about showing who he had been. Viking burial practices were never uniform. They were as varied and strategic as the people themselves. The coins were not a ticket to the next world. They were a signature for this one.